A Voice from Waterloo is the humble tale of an old soldier who was an eyewitness to and participant in many of the scenes he attempts to describe. Edward Cotton served in the 7th Hussars. Wellington is starting to need Prussian reinforcements. Let's begin. La Haye Saint was no sooner in the power of the French troops than they received orders to press as much as possible on that part of our line and clear the way for the Imperial Guard. To avail themselves of the advantages of such a valuable position, they loopholed the gable end of the house, erected a scaffold along the garden wall, and cut holes through the garden hedge, resembling windows. They also threw a force in advance of the garden, which was protected from the fire above by the natural slope, in addition to an artificial bank that abutted upon the natural one, extending from the northeast corner of the garden wall along the roadside to where the monument to Colonel Gordon is erected. This breastwork enabled the enemy to throw a front fire into our riflemen at the knoll and in the sandhole, as well as an oblique fire into Lambert's and Kemp's brigades along the Wavre road. Those arrangements were scarcely completed when a rattling fire was thrown among our sandlarks, who, being unable from their position to return it with any effect, took to flight towards their reserve, followed by all our riflemen from the knoll. The enemy immediately sent a force to the knoll and sandhole, which severely annoyed our 27th, who, until the advance of the whole line, were, with the other troops on that part of the front, kept under a very galling fire, at times, muzzle to muzzle. The French brought 2 guns around the garden hedge and, placing them between the northeast angle of the garden wall and our position, threw grape shot into the 1st, 4th, 27th, 28th, 40th, 79th, and 95th, but, before they had time to fire a second round, a concentrated fire from our riflemen destroyed their gunners. They then pushed on a crowd of skirmishers, who, protected from our fire, crept along the banks, close in upon Alton's, Lambert's, and Kemp's troops. As we could not get at them with powder and ball, it was thought advisable to try the effect of steel. Colonel Omtida led on the 5th German line, upon which they gave way and took shelter as well as they could around the garden hedge. Then a line of cavalry from the hollow rushed upon the Germans, and, as Captain Kincaid of the Rifles observes, every man of them was put to death in a short time, except an officer on a little black horse, who went off to the rear like a shot out of a shovel. Some of our light cavalry attempted to rescue the Germans, and our 95th, who had previously pointed their rifles at the cuirassiers but had suspended their fire through fear of destroying our own infantry, now let fly and entirely cleared the whole front. Their skirmishers then moved to the left, towards Halkett's brigade and the 1st Guards. The eagle eye of the Duke saw it, and he ordered the Guards to form line and drive the enemy off, which they did. When some cuirassiers approached, our lads were in square again. The cuirassiers moved off, receiving fire from the squares of the Guards, as well as from those of the 52nd and 95th. Some time after, the remaining 2 brigades of Bullow's corps debouched and, forming into columns, sent their batteries to the front, which made the Prussian artillery more formidable than that of the French. Blucher's left was making towards Plancenoit, in the right rear of the enemy. At this time, 7 o'clock, the Prussian force in the field amounted to nearly 29,000 men and 64 guns. Their guns commanded the whole of the French right-end potence, which, like the Prussian line, was parallel to the Genappe road and nearly at right angles to their former front. The undulating ground over which the Prussians were advancing rose like an amphitheatre, and their guns, in consequence, could open from the summit of numerous little heights, while at the intervals between the batteries, their troops advanced into the plain. Nothing could be more favorable for a force attacking an enemy's flank. A Prussian battery dislodged a French one on the heights near Chantilly and, taking up the abandoned position, directed its fire upon the enemy posted between Plancenoit and La Belle Alliance. The Prussian left was now close approaching the village of Plancenoit, which, up to the present period, had not been occupied. The French force being less numerous than the Prussian, de Lobau fell back towards the Genappe road, where the Prussian round shot was now thickly falling upon both sides of La Belle Alliance, near which Napoleon had remained during the greater part of the day. The only reserve he now had was the infantry of the Imperial Guard, and the pressure upon his right flank was so great that he was obliged to send the 8 battalions of the Young Guard, with their divisional and 2 12-pounder reserve batteries, under General Duhesme, to the village of Plancenoit as the only means of preventing the Prussians from getting in the French rear. At this time Blucher received intelligence that his 3rd Corps, which had been left at Wavre as a rear guard to check the enemy's corps under Grouchy, had been attacked by a superior force and obliged to retire. Notwithstanding such intelligence might have shaken the firmest nerves, nothing changed the purpose of the indomitable veteran. Blucher saw clearly that the field upon which he was now engaged was the spot where the fate of the campaign would be decided. He therefore sent orders to Thielmann to hold out as well as he could and ordered his left wing to move upon Plancenoit and to get possession of it if possible. Duhesme, with the Young Guard, had arrived at the village and made his dispositions. As the Prussians neared Plancenoit, They were received with a stinging fire of musketry from the French skirmishers, and some French guns opened upon the advancing columns but did not arrest their progress. They gallantly pressed on, took 3 guns, and got possession of the churchyard, a strong position, which shortly after they were compelled to abandon, though not without making a most resolute defense. They rallied near the village and, being reinforced, advanced to make another assault. This being observed by Napoleon, he sent General Moron with 2 battalions of the Old Guard and 2 12-pounder batteries, and shortly after General Pellet, with another battalion of the Guard and a reserve battery. This force, in conjunction with de Lobau's line on their left, attacked and routed the whole Prussian force, pushing them back upon their first position on the opposite heights. This convinced Napoleon that Blucher was not up in sufficient force to make an effective effort against his right flank, and he could, therefore, hold the Prussians in check without making any change in his line of battle opposed to Wellington. Onset now followed onset in rapid succession, and before one assault was met and repulsed, another was prepared and pressing on. His Grace, when he observed the diminished numbers of his brave troops, presenting still the same fearless attitude, felt there must be a limit to human endurance, and frequently turned his telescope in the direction where he expected the Prussian reinforcements to arrive, and who were to cooperate more immediately with his left. Hougoumont, as has been stated, had been repeatedly attacked. The struggle for its possession was still most obstinate and sanguinary. The large orchard and wood continued to be the scene of a dreadful carnage. The enemy generally outflanked our men upon their left, and at times, stealing along under the east hedge from the southeast angle of the orchard, opened a flank fire upon them, when driven through the north hedge near our friendly hollow way. But whenever our foes attempted to cross the orchard near the east garden wall, the Coldstream sent a galling flank fire into them. Hougoumont had been reinforced by the 2nd Line and light companies of Duplat's brigade, as well as by the advance guard battalion of Brunswickers, who, together with the guards and the remainder of the Nassau men and Hanoverian riflemen, drove the enemy out of the orchard into the wood. During the time Duplat's brigade was in its advanced position, it suffered from the French light troops. Many of the officers were killed or wounded. Duplat was killed. Skirmishing had gone on briskly at the farms of Papelet, La Haye, the hamlet of Smohan, and along our left, where the want of ammunition was so great that the enemy pressed close up to the hedge, driving in our skirmishers. But they were soon driven back when a fresh supply arrived. From the time that La Haye Sainte had been taken by the enemy, the attacks upon our centre were carried on with the greatest desperation. The French crowded in swarms round the knoll and sandhole, and behind the artificial and roadside banks, which formed excellent breastworks for the advanced skirmishers. These, by laying their muskets on the bank at the level of the plain, could sweep it in all directions. Our advance at times moved forward and dislodged them, but they returned on the falling back of our troops. This fire was vigorously replied to by Lambert's and Kemp's brigades, and Pax Royal's. Ompteda's brigade was reduced to a mere handful of men. Kielman's was in a similar condition. In fact, Alten's division had dwindled away to a weak brigade. The remains of Halkett's brigade were from the first formed into 2 weak squares. No portion of the line was more attacked both by infantry and cavalry, or more cannonaded than Alten's division. He himself was severely wounded. The 73rd, one of his regiments, was for a time commanded by a subaltern, Lieutenant Stewart. Pack's brigade was reduced to a skeleton and had, by forming column, wheeling into line, and by edging and moving to its right, got from the left close to the Genappe road, a little in rear of where stood the so-called Wellington tree. Adams' brigade, since brought into action, had been subjected to such a furious cannonade and repeated cavalry attacks that it was deemed necessary to draw it behind the position. On one occasion a French horse battery was pushed forward near the southeast angle of the orchard of Hougoumont, where it opened upon the brigade. But our batteries on the ridge concentrated their fire upon it and drove it off. Our artillerymen cheered. It witnessed the great effect produced by some rockets which were thrown from the valley upon the French horse. Our batteries had been most successful on this part of the line in checking and destroying the enemy's cavalry. It must have been evident to Napoleon that, notwithstanding the battle had been raging for more than 7 hours, the victory which he had calculated upon early in the morning was yet to be gained. Although the day was far advanced, he showed no despair but continued to feed the fight with fresh victims. The result of the operations, up to this time, had been most destructive to both sides, more particularly to our gallant foes, who from acting on the offensive throughout, were frequently much exposed to the close and direct fire of our batteries in advancing to the attack and retiring to reform after each successive repulse. Our troops everywhere maintained a degree of cool forbearance and courage, which none but British soldiers could show under such trying circumstances. About 7:30 p.m., the colours of the 30th and 73rd were sent to the rear, to the satisfaction of many. The colonel of the latter regiment, the late Lord Harris, who was wounded soon after, took the 73rd's colour from the officer, gave it in charge of a sergeant, to carry to the rear. The enemy's cavalry, who were now nearly sobered, would come up singly and fire their carbines at the squares. Their horse artillery often galloped up, unlimbered, when crash, crash, came the grape into Halkett's squares, making gaps which it was admirable to see the fine fellows fill up, and that without orders. Whenever the Duke came, which at this momentous period was often, there was a low whisper in the ranks, "Here's the Duke." And all was as steady as on parade. No matter what the havoc and destruction might be, the Duke was always the coolest man there. In the words of an eyewitness of this bloody scene, the Duke was coolness personified. It really appeared that the more desperate the fight, the more determined were the few brave fellows that remained to hold their ground. Yet often would a murmur escape them, such as, "This is thundering murderous work. Why don't we go into them? Let us give them the cold steel," etc., etc. But such murmurs were soon hushed, and again were displayed those traits of unyielding passive courage, the grandest, the most sublime characteristics of the British soldier. The troops evinced in their resignation and discipline unparalleled in European armies. Though confident in their chiefs and themselves, their foes were not less so. A French cuirassier officer, a prisoner in Halkett's left square, replied, in a surly and snappish tone, to an officer of the 30th who asked him what force Bonaparte had, "You will see directly, sir." It was now past 7 o'clock. The Prussians kept up a distant cannonade and skirmished with the French right-end potents, seeking a favorable opportunity to make a more powerful attack with the fresh troops that were then seen advancing. These war-breathing bands, led by Blucher in person, full of determination, sure to strike home with the whole force of their arm, were at length seen streaming along in swarms, extending round Napoleon's right wing, and menacing his rear. The Allied line stood firm and unbroken. The day was fast waning, and Napoleon began to manifest impatience and felt much anxiety for the result of the battle. He evidently must have imagined that a desperate effort to break our centre could alone prevent the defeat, which the arrival of the Prussians in such force must render inevitable. Thus situated, he had no alternative but to rush into destruction or success. The political existence and future destiny of this renowned chief were fast drawing to a close. He could not reasonably anticipate assistance from Grouchy, therefore, he at once resolved, as a last resort, to attempt to force the Allied position with his devoted guards, that immovable phalanx which, in the greatest emergencies, had invariably stood as the rallying point and rampart of their army. Count Drouot was ordered to move forward into the valley, in front of and between La Belle Alliance and Hougoumont enclosures, the remaining 12 battalions of the Old and Middle Guard, and form them into 2 columns of attack and a reserve. With these, Napoleon decided upon making what proved his final struggle, directing their advance between La Haye Sainte and Hougoumont, upon the Allied centre, undoubtedly impressed with the idea that an overwhelming mass of fresh and chosen troops must succeed against an enemy shattered and reduced by repeated and furious attacks, and a ravaging cannonade. 4 battalions of the Middle Guard, in massive battalion columns, a favourite plan of the French, and formed left in front into 1 column of attack, were to advance towards a point about where the line now stands, then occupied by Maitland's brigade, the 2nd and 3rd battalions of the 1st British Foot Guards, and on their left by Halkett's British brigade, whose right was the 69th and 33rd, and his left the 30th and 73rd regiments. 4 more battalions of the Middle Guard, with 2 of the Old Guard, chiefly chasseurs, en echelons, upon their left rear, formed a 2nd column of attack, lower down the valley. The other 2 battalions of the Old Guard remained in reserve nearly opposite La Belle Alliance, right and left, and in the rear of them were drawn up in reserve the remains of the splendid cavalry force with which the Emperor had been making such desperate but fruitless attacks on our position. These constituted his last reserve. The attacking columns were to be supported by the remains of Delaun's corps on their right and Ray's corps on the left. Those movements along the French position indicated that a decisive blow, which the situation of the battle now rendered inevitable, was about to be directed against our centre. It was soon discovered, by the well-sustained order and compactness of the columns, and the dark waving forest of bear skin caps, that our prowess would be tested by the redoubtable Imperial Guard. At this period of the action, many of our guns stood abandoned in position. Some were rendered useless by the enemy's fire, others had the muzzles bent down from the excessive heat, some were left for want of materials to load them, many touch holes melted away, and officers were seen applying paper with a small hole in which to place the fuse, thus preventing it from dropping into the touch hole. Numerous gunners were driven off by the enemy. Our confidence in the Duke was unbounded, notwithstanding that our army was much exhausted and reduced. Disorder and confusion continued in our rear, the roads were crowded with broken carriages, baggage, wounded officers, soldiers, dismounted dragoons, and trains of followers from the combined army, more particularly the foreigners, many of whom gave as a reason for abandoning the field that Napoleon and his legions were invincible, he would certainly be victorious, and that it was quite absurd to contend against them. In fact, what with the killed, wounded, those in attendance, and others who had gone to the rear through fear, our fighting army, towards the close of the day, became reduced to a handful of men, a mere wreck of its former self. It is on record that upwards of 12,000 had sought refuge in the wood of Soigné, whose desertion imposed great hardships on those who gallantly remained to achieve so glorious a victory. These were resolved to conquer or to perish on this sanguinary field, and by none was this feeling more powerfully manifested than by the few remaining in Sir Colin Halkett's brigade. They were often heard to exclaim, "This is thundering murderous work, we shall see which will stand killing longest." Vivian, who had been all day on the left of our line, observing the advance towards his position of part of the Prussian cavalry of General Ruder, attached to the First Corps under General Zieten, and being aware that fresh cavalry was wanted on the right, put his brigade in motion. He was soon met by Lord Uxbridge, who felt pleased that the Duke's wishes had been anticipated. Vandeleur, who was also on the left, was ordered to follow Vivian. The right regiment, the 10th Hussars, was posted by Lord Uxbridge about 100 yards in the rear of the junction of the crossroads, near the Lion. The 18th Hussars were on their left, stretching towards the Genappe road, behind the remains of Alten's division, and the 1st German Hussars were in the second line. After posting Vivian, Uxbridge joined Vandeleur, whom he posted parallel with the Nivelle road, the 11th on the right, the 16th next, and on the left, the remains of the 12th Light Dragoons, in rear of Adams, Maitland's, and Halkett's brigades. He then returned to Vivian. In order to draw his own conclusions, his lordship dismounted and, unattended, advanced down the slope to try and get a view of the enemy who were hidden by the smoke. Vivian rode after him and begged him not to place himself in such imminent danger, on which he returned, saying that he was of Vivian's opinion that it would be best to wait for an opportunity to attack. The opportune arrival of the fresh cavalry upon this part of our line gave in no small degree confidence to the shattered remains of the brave fellows who were left to defend the front. The exceedingly small force which really defended the crest of our line on this terrible day is almost incredible, and their conduct beyond all praise. They not only stood the brunt of the strife, but upon their steadiness and determination depended entirely the holding of the position. Uxbridge returned to the Duke, who was at a short distance to the right, watching the formation of heavy columns on our right of La Belle Alliance. They were preparing for the coming storm. 'Twas now the chieftain's soul was mighty proved. That in the shock of charging hosts, unmoved, amidst confusion, horror, and despair, examined all the dreadful scenes of war. In peaceful thought the field of death surveyed. To fainting squadrons sent the timely aid. Inspired repulsed battalions to engage. And taught the doubtful battle where to rage. His Grace dispatched Colonel Fremantle in search of the Prussians, who were expected to join the left of our line, and to request Zieten, their chief, to send on a part of his force to strengthen some weak parts of the front. Zieten did not feel authorized to comply with the Duke's request but said that his whole force would soon be up. Numerous applications reached the Duke for support and reinforcements, or to be relieved by the second line, as divisions, brigades, and regiments had dwindled away to skeletons and handfuls of men. The only reply was, they must hold their ground to the last man. Sir Guy Campbell delivered that answer to the gallant remains of Pack's brigade, and the Duke told Sir Colin Halkett that there must not be the least symptom of falling back, as everything depended on the steadiness of the front troops. Frequently, as the Duke passed the men, he heard murmurs, such as, "Are we to be massacred here? Let us go at them, let us give them Brummer gum," i.e. the bayonet, and he would calmly reply, "Wait a little longer, my lads, you shall have at them presently." The ammunition was nearly exhausted when, fortunately, an artillery cart galloped along and dropped some casks into the squares. This raised their spirits and made them feel more satisfied. The Duke, finding he must depend entirely on his own resources to ward off the blow about to be struck by his antagonist, made such dispositions as his means would allow. It was indeed high time to strain every nerve to strengthen and defend the point where the fiercest storm of battle was about to burst, and repel the last and most desperate struggle, now ready to be made. Maitland's and Halkett's right was advanced. The Brunswick battalions on the right were to move into the space between Halkett's British and Cruiser's Nassau brigades. Chassey's Dutch-Belgian division was to cross the Nivelle road and form, Dorbriem on the right, and Ditmars on the left, in the rear of Adams, Maitland's, and Halkett's brigades. The remains of the Allied cavalry, except Meulles' brigade, were in the rear of the position on the right of the Genappe road, and most of our infantry were deployed into four deep lines and, for shelter, lay recumbent on the ground behind the crest of the ridge. About this time a French officer of Carabineers rode into the right of the 52nd Regiment as a deserter and announced to Major Blair and Colonel Sir A. Fraser that Napoleon was about to attack us at the head of his Imperial Guard. This was made known to the Duke. Napoleon, it appeared, was marshalling the Imperial Guard for the approaching attack, of which His Grace was well aware. The skirmishers in advance of their columns about La Haye Sainte, the knoll and sand pit, and along the valley right and left, threw out a rattling fire for the purpose of harassing and weakening our line, in order to clear the way for the grand attack by the Imperial Guard. This fire was vigorously replied to by our troops, who were partially covered from the enemy's fire by the hedgerow and banks on this part of the front. Our gallant 27th, upon the bank at the junction of the roads, was still much exposed. Our 95th Rifles and the 4th Foot were extended along the Wavre road. The 40th, 79th, 28th, and 1st Royals were in line behind the rear hedge. The fire increased, and it appeared as if all would be borne down before it. The banks on the roadside, the garden wall, the knoll, and sand pit swarmed with skirmishers, who seemed determined to keep down our fire in front. Those behind the artificial bank seemed more intent upon destroying the 27th, who at this time, it may literally be said, were lying dead in square. Their loss after La Haye Sainte had fallen was awful, without the satisfaction of having scarcely fired a shot. Many of our troops in the rear of the ridge was similarly situated. A British officer who was an eyewitness of the gallant conduct of the 27th, says, if ever the sovereign gives them another motto, it should be, muzzle to muzzle, for so they fought at Waterloo. Efficient artillery upon this part of the line we had none. Thus the enemy again brought up some guns near the corner of La Haye Sainte garden hedge and placed them so that their muzzles were on a level with our ridge, from whence they rapidly dealt out grape upon Kielman's edges 2 squares, completely smashing them, until they, like the rest, were reduced to a mere clump of men. The artillery and musketry fire was increasing. The skirmishers pressing on, and their drums beating, foretold the advance of columns to the charge. Upon this, the Prince of Orange ordered 2 battalions of the Nassau Brigade, under General Kruser, to advance and gallantly placed himself at their head. The Prince was struck by a musket ball in the left shoulder, and the command of this part of our line devolved on Count Kielman's edge. The Nassau men were giving way when the 5 battalions of Brunswick infantry moved into the interval between Halkett and Kruser. But before they were in position, they were received by such a stinging fire from the French skirmishers and a crashing fire of grape from their artillery and became so enveloped in smoke that they could not get into order until they were in close contact with the enemy. This vigorous attack caused the part of Alten's division on Halkett's left, with the Nassau men and Brunswickers, to give way and fall back under the crest of the ridge. Now came really the tug of war, the poise or balance of the battle. At this critical moment, Wellington galloped to the spot and, addressing himself to the Brunswickers, succeeded, by the electrifying influence of his voice and presence, in rallying the discomfited columns. Lieutenant Colonel Sir Alexander Gordon was mortally wounded on this occasion. By the example and encouragement of the commanding officers, the other brigades were also rallied and formed. The Duke went off hastily to the right again. The battle had now been raging for nearly 8 hours, and not a square had been broken, nor had the enemy gained more than one advantage, viz., the capture of La Haye Sainte, which was through one of those mischances in war which often mar the best planned arrangements. But those continued furious attacks had not been met and repulsed without a most severe loss to the troops who had stood the brunt of the battle, and had been so long exposed to a murderous cannonade. This concludes the 8th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. What do you think of Cotton's description of the battle? Please subscribe for more stories and leave a comment.